Okay, here we are. We are on the Kill Your Gods podcast, a very special episode. You guys know that I've done a few books on here. We've typically done that in pieces. This book I had no intention on doing a podcast about, but I loved it so much. And there's actually not, I couldn't find any other podcasts that were really talking about it. We are talking 1949 by George R. Stewart, Earth Abides. And my guest this week, I found him online. He was talking about the book very recently. I said, "Hey, you want to come on?" And he said, "Sure." Geordie Guy, how you doing, Geordie?
Good, mate. Yourself, how are you?
Very good, very good. We're recording this on extreme time delay. It is 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And where is it where you are?
It's just ticked over midday in Sydney, Australia.
There it is, Sydney, Australia. It's actually very unique. I mentioned that the company I work for, our parent company who bought us, is right in Sydney. So I've actually I had to be looking at but they asked me to write something about their headquarters. So I was like looking like at Botany Bay. I don't know. Um, so yeah, well, let's find out a little bit about you. I don't know if there's anything you have to promote. You can tell us where we find you on social media.
I don't really have anything to promote. I'm a nerd that lives in Australia. I Yeah, I guess that's kind of me. I work for one of the big telcos over here, so kind of like the Australian version of AT&T or Sprint, if you like. So
Okay.
if you think about the sort of person who does that and loves to cook
Mhm.
and read and play with computers, you've pretty much got me in a nutshell.
Well, I was actually kind of you referred to yourself as a nerd there, correct?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is there anything specific to it's only been like the last 10, 15 years or so where I feel like nerd culture has become its own thing. Is there any specific flavor to like the Australian side of that?
I don't think there's anything particularly Australian about it.
Hmm.
But yeah, I absolutely agree that it's sort of picked up in the last 10, 15 years as the stuff we got beat up for in high school is
Hmm.
now gives you a good paying job and uh, the tide has turned a bit there. Hey,
Hmm. Yeah, I feel bad. The episode I just released today was just really like dunking on anime, which I understand if people like anime. It's just I have my own thing. I'm into nerdy things as well. That's actually pretty much the whole gist of the podcast. Kill Your Gods came from I was arguing with somebody about wrestling, which I love wrestling, but it is objectively pretty dumb as an art form. So I just,
that,
I
absolutely, it's okay to like pretty dumb stuff.
mhm.
Um, Yeah, I kind of like I'm not an anime guy because that's very, very different to liking anime, right? Being an
Yeah,
anime guy.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I occasionally watch some of the old Studio Ghibli stuff that
Mm.
like the really classics because the animation's really cool and it's but no, I beyond that, I've got as a joke there, I've got a Zoom background that I put on occasionally when I want to freak people out, and that is yeah, there is nothing more disturbing than that.
You got your waifu back there.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
that's yeah, no.
Mm.
It's a little bit creepy. No, no, thank you.
Nice. Nah, for me. It's just I think a lot of the problem I have is really a lot of my friends. Really, the truth is most of my friends are into stuff like that, but none of them really read at all, and that's why it kind of bothers me because this thing that I'm into, if anything, kind of isolates me. Where I would want these people. I think my next thing is I'm going to be challenging these people who only read manga, who only watch anime, and just like you're going to read Dostoevsky with me, and you will be a better person for it. You might not like me anymore after, but you'll be a better person for it.
There's a culture injection there.
Exactly. Yes. Have a little bit of everything, not just
Yeah.
fast food. But so what is your literary background? How are you a big time reader? How did you even wander into Earth Abides?
I really like the entire genre of sort of speculative fiction, and a lot of the
Mm,
time that looks like sci-fi. And that sort of goes with the nerd side of things, but a lot of the time it doesn't, right? So the favorite premise of a book for me is what if everything was totally different?
mm,
And this fits really well into that slot. I particularly enjoyed reading The Man in the High Castle. If you're familiar with that in the Amazon spin-off series, it's what would have happened if we actually lost World War II, and the victors there were Germany and Italy and Japan. So those taking of something that's just a given, right? That
Mhm.
the Allies won World War II, that there are lots of people in the world who aren't dead of a virus in the case of Earth abides, and just tipping it on its head, and you almost get to play with reality a little bit. So we
Mhm.
know the way that the world is. What if it was just not that way at all? So I really love books like this, and I've got friends that have been at me to read this for a while. In a lot of ways, for me, reading is when I'm kind of nerded out, when
Mhm.
I've had too much computers, when I've been writing too many apps, when I've just sort of been doing that stuff,
Mhm.
just getting there with a book. It's realer.
I understand that. There's like a definite need to have like a quick shift from like right brain to left brain. Like
Hmm.
you need to let the technical side just like lay down and have a nap.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. Otherwise, I just crash out myself, right? I wind up stretched out on the couch,
Mhm.
1,000 yard stare, just because I've tried to put too much numbers in my head.
Yeah, could definitely burn you out. See, you know what's funny? I haven't done it so much in fiction, speculative fiction, as you put it. However, I am a fan of like alternate history.
Hmm.
There are which I think Man in the High Castle would definitely qualify as, where whereas something like Earth Abides is obviously something that could happen versus something that has happened and tweaking a few things. But I think that also just comes naturally if you're interested in history in the first place, and like you hear things like about how Archduke Ferdinand got killed in World War I, and realize like, oh, like that almost sounds like an alternate history in and of itself because it was so unlikely how it happened
Yeah,
that literally if one of these tumblers had not fallen into place, it doesn't happen.
and it very nearly didn't happen a bunch of times. There's a
Mhm.
podcast I listen to from time to time called Hardcore History, but
Love it.
it is very hardcore.
Mhm.
Um, Incidentally, it's the worst podcast to listen to when you go for a jog. Because I wound up jogging like 5 extra miles just because I was engrossed in it. But he has
Well,
a
not only that, but
episode around that.
for anybody listening who doesn't know hardcore history, they tend to drop 2 to 3 episodes a year, and they're like 5 hours long. So
Yeah,
you'll get a hell of a jog out of that. Sorry to
yeah,
interrupt.
no, not at all. Um, but yeah, all the stuff that had to happen, and like he failed the first time and managed to serendipitously get a second crack at it. Like it does really feel like that sliding doors moment where everything could have been completely different if it was only slightly different.
Oh yeah, no, there was an assassination attempt earlier in the day. The people scattered. The Archduke insisted on going to the hospital to see the wounded. They turned down a wrong way and had to do not only a K turn, but like a 1913 K turn. You can imagine what the transmission on a car is back then. And one of the assassins, it was having like a sad, man, I failed to kill that royal sandwich in a cafe. And then he turns and he sees the guy basically stuck in between cars and runs out
Yeah,
and blasts him and blasts his wife. And long story short,
yeah,
millions of people died. Hitler rose to power, etc.
yeah, yeah, etc., etc. It all went downhill from there.
Okay. So, all right, let's dive into it. I'm gonna jump around a little bit here, but the way I tend to do these is we'll just do a quick run through of the plot, and anytime there's something interesting, we can just stop and talk about it. So feel free to interrupt whenever.
Yeah, sure.
All right, we meet Isherwood, hence known as Ish. He gets bit by a rattlesnake after grabbing a hammer while mountain climbing or something like that. He's out in nature. He awakes much later after the Great Catastrophe. So immediately, it is so hard to read this in modern pop culture because I don't know if his was the first to really use this, but it's been repeated ad infinitum of the person who is just gone and wakes up in a completely devastated world. I think immediately of
Hmm.
Walking Dead. I think of 28 Days Later.
Yeah, Day of the Triffids sort of popped
Oh,
into my mind there. Um, when what is it? A day that you know to be Wednesday starts out sounding like a Sunday. Like so, he's sort of come to in hospital, and in
mm,
that book, the protagonist is blinded. So some disaster has happened that means he's sort of missed the start of something
mm,
huge.
mhm. Yeah, we have that here. I find it interesting because really it kind of because it's been used so much in like horror. Again, going into this book, not really knowing much about it, just knowing it was post-apocalyptic, and the people who have used the trope so many times, I kept waiting for some kind of monster to show up, at least at
Yeah,
first.
yeah, absolutely. I expect at the start of the book, like some people sort of come by, and he tries to get them to help him, and they run off. And I'm like, there's
Mhm,
something out there that they're fleeing from, right? I know, and that's correct. There is,
mhm, right.
but not what I was expecting.
But well, not only that, but even if you take out the supernatural, like I think the show The Walking Dead could on a lot of it would remain the same if you remove the entire zombie aspect of it. But also from movies and art like that, you immediately think like, oh well, everybody's gonna be at war with each other the whole time, and it's gonna be this big
Mm.
violent. And this is actually a pretty chill post-apocalypse. Everyone's just trying to like keep away from each other. Um, you know what? I might be getting ahead of myself a little bit. Let's
No,
do that.
no, no. It does seem like from the start of the book, everything's pretty chill. And I thought about maybe why that might be. I think it's maybe because it was so big. Like if you
Mm,
think about things like 28 days and all the rest of it, there's still heaps of people left over in
mhm.
some state or another. Um, so there's more drama, but this is a bit more thinky.
Right. Yeah. This has definitely been just a massive calamity where, like, I think it would be safe to say probably like 95% of people were killed, if not more. I don't remember if there's a number mentioned in here at all, but
No, it doesn't. But there's not many people left.
yeah,
Like
like literally almost every person we meet in this has had every single person in their life also die.
yeah,
So have been mass amounts. So he returns home to Berkeley. There are some survivors, but they're not doing well. One is a drunkard who just drinks himself into stupefaction, who ish more or less like, oh, I'll come back to you later. And then he's just dead when he finds him. His first good spot of luck, he is joined by Princess the dog, who we'll see a lot of. I loved Princess. Um, so with nothing else to do, he just travels around the country. And again, this is a very I've been trained to look at this sort of thing differently because it's almost always like, okay, I gotta. It seems like the beats in the stories that have come since have always been like, I need to find a group of people nearby, and then we need to build a stronghold. Meanwhile, we're like 30 pages into this, and he's like, I'll just drive to New York.
yeah. That was as not an American. That was a weird one for me, right? Because I've got some extended family in the US. I've been there a few times, but a
Mm,
lot of these places, like I'm sort of pulling up Google Maps trying to figure out where they are. I'm like, that's
mm,
a long drive. And as an Australian, driving from one side of the country to the other is extremely dangerous, right? So
yes.
there's like huge deserts in the middle there. It's like 4 days without seeing any petrol stations. So
It is a
it,
very common trope in the US right now to just in any kind of humor being like, no, Australia, everything in Australia wants to kill you. All the wildlife is built for murder. You do not
yeah,
belong there. Stay on the
yeah,
coasts.
and it's we're only kind of joking, right?
Yeah.
It's like it is dangerous, and this sort of comes through in this book as well. If something goes wrong, you've got no help.
Right.
And in modern Australia, that's just because it's huge. But in this book, there is no help because everyone's dead.
Mhm.
And infrastructure's in like various states of disarray. Gas pumps might work, might not work.
Mhm. Yeah, I
It was
think
a weird one.
mhm. Well, see, I think that's not even necessarily just Australia, even though you guys have more of the danger aspect of going straight through the entire country. But I've even heard friends who have like gone to visit the UK or whatever and have like suggested to friends there, like, oh, let's rent a car and drive up to Scotland. Everyone looks at them like, why would we do that? That sounds horrible. Why would you do that? But I feel in the US, it's number one, it's very much a car culture. And number two, our train lines are just kind of horrible. Like they're really expensive where they still are. So it's almost easier to just do the drive. Like I've gone cross country. I think most people I know have gone cross country at one point or another.
Hmm. Yeah.
It's
So whereas we're a car focused country as well, but it's
mhm,
not the way that it is in the US. We have public transport, we have good rail systems in the major, at least in the major cities and between
mhm,
the major cities as well. So this idea of him just jumping into the car and go, oh, I'm just going to go to the other side of the country via, the top and the bottom of it, to the point where he even sort of works out a way of getting a motorbike into the back of the car that he uses. Uh,
mhm.
that's a lifeboat, except for a car version of it.
Oh yeah, pretty much anything that happens at any point. Plus, I also think I can understand some of the notion of why a survivor would do that in the US, if just that our climate and the geography of an area changes in the different regions of the US. The geography changes like dramatically. So you don't know if
Yeah.
one place is going to be more suited towards survivors than another.
Yeah. So, and again, I don't want to spend the whole time contrasting Australia, but
Mhm.
Australia's doesn't have that, I guess, breadth of different climates, right? But broadly speaking, the top half of it's really hot and the bottom half of it's fairly cold, but not so cold that you get 2 feet of snow.
Right.
Um, so it snows on top of mountains and stuff. So
Mhm.
it was kind of, it was almost fun for me to kind of go on the journey with him where he goes to all
Mm.
these different places. It talks a little bit in the book about how things might have changed. Infrastructure might have broken down quicker in places that had higher humidity and stuff like that. So I got to find out a little bit about these places. It was kind of
Yeah.
cool.
Huh. That's a neat, you got a little bonus out of it that
Yeah.
I missed out on.
Yeah.
Um
Yeah, there was a few. Yeah, it's quite interesting because a lot of from outside of the US, a lot of the media we consume, the art we consume that's US centric, you'd be forgiven for thinking the entire US was Manhattan and South California, right?
right.
Um, so going through these places like Georgia and things like that, which aren't really common in the media we consume, sort of gave me a bit of an eye opener.
Okay. Okay, cool. Um Oh, okay. So want to get it out of the way now because it does come up when people talk about this book. There's a particularly problematic little section here where, as he's traveling around the country, Ish meets some people, including a Southern black family that some people talk about. It's a black man and a pregnant woman, and I believe a little girl. I actually don't recall whether it was a boy or a girl, but they very
A
much.
kid, yeah,
Yeah, it's a kid, but they don't look him in the eye. They don't really give him straight answers. They seem confused what to do. And Ish even has a little bit of like a bad thought of like, oh, I could just stay here and like be their ruler and be their king. And
yeah,
a lot of people jump on that, but at the same time, we see so much later in the book that Ish is kind of prone to thinking non-productive thoughts of getting a little carried away,
yeah.
which is so that's how maybe I'm apologizing for Ish, but he's shown as flawed all throughout the book.
Yeah, he is. It's really cool that you're saying that because I had a couple of negative opinions on him. He had flaws. There is that scene where he meets up with the black family later in the book when it's sort of put together a bit of a colony, I guess,
Mhm.
or an outpost. One of the first children and sort of gets into adulthood a little bit later when the book jumps forward in time is referred to as Simple, and we get the idea that she is disabled in some way mentally.
Mhm.
And a lot of his thoughts about other people, they're pretty negative,
They're
and
very
they're not things that.
dismissive. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And his relationship with his kids later in the book, where he's got one clear favorite who's he sees as being more intelligent, whereas the others are perhaps more athletic and strong. Some of those scenes were pretty confronting. It's an interesting story, and but the guy is occasionally a bit of a dick.
Yes. Yes. And particularly for the racial aspect here, I think there's also something that people need to keep in mind is that this book was published in 1949. So, I mean, in a case like that, if you could imagine being in like the Jim Crow South and being an oppressed person, and suddenly, you're not just everybody, we're dealing with the loss of humanity, but you're also dealing with the loss of your specific community, the good and bad. So if your entire community was, don't make eye contact with the white people because God knows what will happen, and then a new one wanders in, like they're not it nothing of this really struck me as like, oh, they're being deferential to him. Like, no, that's the only world they know. And even in this, isn't that sad in this post-apocalypse that they still have that with them for the one white person they've seen in months?
Yeah, that was. I mean, Australia has a similar sort of, well, it's a bad history with
Yeah,
our Indigenous, our First Nations people.
mhm.
And that scene just translated so easily that there would be people who were like, well, this is what it's like. White people are dangerous.
Mhm.
And potentially there's more danger here because while those people historically haven't been able to lean on things like the authorities, the justice system to their favor. There is none now. So whatever this guy wants to do, he can do. And he does flirt with the idea of all the things to bring back into the post-apocalyptic world. He toys with slavery as an idea, but thankfully thinks better of it.
Right. So from there, Ish returns to California, and there him and Princess are driving around, and Princess just randomly runs into a house, and there we meet M. So M is roughly 10 years older than him. We find out that she has had children who have perished in the Great Catastrophe. It's hinted that they very subtly mention that she is of some kind of mixed race. I believe she's some kind of like Black Native American kind of thing. I'm not
Yeah,
entirely
there
sure.
was. I remember where this is revealed, and like she gets upset about it later because she's whatever it is, she's able to hide it, or it's not
Mhm.
immediately obvious. And she talks about her the moons on her fingernails being blue. And I didn't get that reference. I had a bit of a Google around trying to figure out what that meant, but I got the overarching idea that she felt like she perhaps misled him about her background.
Mhm. Wait, what was the moons on the fingernails? Because that I actually did not know.
So when she reveals this, or she doesn't really reveal it. She doesn't come out and say my background is this, but she gets upset, and he basically implies that he did know, or it had occurred to him. And he mentions something. She mentions about the moons on her fingernails, like where the fingernail actually gets to the finger is blue. And whatever
Mhm.
she's letting out about her background, that's apparently a sign of it. But I didn't really get it.
Okay. Okay. Now I think I don't know. There might be some racial difference in how fingernails look. I'm trying to
Yeah.
not pull that memory from my head. Uh, so they pretty quickly have sex and fall for each other. And again, this is another interesting thing in these apocalypse narratives is they tend to pretty strictly go like one way or the other, where either sexual opportunism. Again, I immediately think of 28 Days Later because as soon as they find two young women, it's like, okay, well, they're going to be sex slaves for the soldiers. Or
Yeah.
other shows where it's just complete sexual apathy, where it's just, I'm too busy trying to survive. That's it.
Yeah, yeah, they very definitely do tend to go both ways, and this book's really interesting with the way it treats sexual morality. Like later in the book, they talk about people getting effectively married,
Hmm.
partnered's probably a better term, but it is revealed that sort of 16, 17 appears it's happening earlier than is legal in most places in the real
Hmm.
modern world.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, they do seem to build up a little bit of a law, like LORE law around it. But yeah, they do seem to go one way or the other. Everyone's either appealing to their baser instincts, or it's just sort of everyone's too busy trying to find food and water.
Um, all right, I'll do this a little bit and then we can actually go through the characters. So more people join in the community. They all begin having many children. And I think that's kind of where the first break happens. And that's where we have the quick years.
Yeah,
But
so it's a weird one. Where twice in the book, it sort of does this literary trick, or it goes anyway sometime later.
mhm.
Um,
Which I really like because in a situation like this, it's we had the chaos and then there were some stable years,
yeah, yeah, and that's really set up with this sort of tradition of carving the year number into a rock,
mhm,
and naming it. You sort of, and it's a breath of fresh air because I've read plenty of these books where you kind of tell that the author wants to skip forward in time a bit, but feels almost compelled to make up filler content for what happened because it's necessary for people to have aged, matured, learnt things to get to the next bit they want to talk about. So while I kind of mentally had that SpongeBob screen where it goes, later that day, I kind of appreciated it. You don't need to drag me through the quiet years. You can just jump. It's cool.
exactly. Especially when I think one of the huge appeals of this book is the fact that it essentially the timeline is a lifetime. Like we meet Ish in his 20s and then it
Yeah,
is the duration of his life. Like if you tried to fill
yeah,
in every detail and make it all exciting, it would be overkill.
yeah. 100%. Is there's sort of towards the end of the book, as he gets older, and that starts to mean stuff to him. He starts to think a lot about what sort of society he's leaving behind and how it's changed.
Mhm.
It would take, it would be a 9 book series of a pretty boring one at that if we tried to
Yeah.
spell out each day.
So I wanted to go through some of my favorite names of the years that we have here.
Yeah.
Some are basic. Year 3 was Year of the Fires. I'm having to read this right out of the book because, again, infuriatingly, there's just like no real fan community of this book online that like just has it all listed out like you would hope.
Yeah, it's weird. I kind of expected there to be a wikier about it. You know, these sort of fan-driven wikis about every
Mhm.
available topic.
Mhm.
But there wasn't. It was a bit of a surprise to me because I've talked about the book a lot to a lot of people, and it came really heavily recommended. So there is fans out there somewhere.
Yeah, there's no great. I think part of the other aspect is it does seem like a lot of these major fandoms when they come up, it's not just around the books. They tend to kind of lionize the author themselves. And as far as I can tell, looking around, it doesn't say I can't find anything George R. Stewart saying like this is why I wrote this book. This is what I thought was interesting about it. This was the process. Like there's none of that.
Yeah,
He just
I,
woke
I
up one day
kind
and
of
wrote this book.
yeah, I kind of expected him to, I don't know, have been some sort of frontierman or something. That
Mhm.
he obviously has a lot of knowledge about the US in general, climates and things like that I talked about enjoying before. So I kind of he obviously has an understanding of the country, and he has some understanding of survival techniques and things like that. I kind of expected there to be more of a backstory than I've been able to find.
Yeah, we've been spoiled by the postmodern author who like poor. I've been reading so much Vonnegut lately, and the man's opinions on everything are he will put the motivation for the book right in the book for no just because he feels it. And here we just
Yeah.
have a dearth. We have Year 5, which was Year of the Bulls, because bull dodging became a fun game and pastime. I also love just how monotonous and dumb a lot of the reasons for them are. Like, oh
Hmm.
yeah, bull dodging was big that year. Um, the bad year that had mad cow disease and grasshoppers. Year of the Lions when they started coming in. So that actually leads to a cool aspect of the book, which is a lot of the ecology. Is they straight up state like in the quick years. Actually, that's a big notion of the quick years because that's where we get to see this happen. How these populations will just like soar and plummet as things go, and like for a few years, like there's just ants like crazy, and then they just balance themselves out. And then the same
Hmm.
with the cows, and then the same with the lions.
And rats.
Rats, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, that's I found that really interesting as well because where what I said at the start about how I really like the what if. You're really doing a what if experiment. If you just take humans out, what happens? Well,
Hmm.
obviously there's winners and losers in that. So the book has got several places where there's just a plague of something. And it gets to the point where there's so much of that thing it consumes all the available resources and dies back down again.
Right. And it
Um,
also forces the humans to like recalibrate how they're living, depending on
yeah,
that.
yeah. The rats was particularly harrowing for me. Sort of uh, the dog gets attacked by them and they turn to cannibalism, and I found myself down the rats, I should point out, not the protagonists.
Right.
I wound up sort of down a Wikipedia hole chasing it whether that would actually happen. It's one of those books that a lot of the times with these types of books I put them down and go research something, but I consumed this book so quickly because I enjoyed it so much. It was like over in the space of 24 hours.
Oh
um,
wow.
that I had to sort of turn around afterwards and sort of Google some of those ecological wars that were happening.
Hmm. Um, okay, so I think in the quick years, this is actually a good time to get into the main characters since this is where they all kind of arrive. So we obviously have Ish, we have Princess, we have M. Also in here, we have oh god, sorry, I was not as good with my notes as I thought. I know we have Ezra. Ezra shows up with so yeah, he initially shows up all on his own, but M and Ish are pretty much straight up like, listen, we like you. He has like a nice English accent, but they like, we like you. there's not enough of us here. This will be like a love triangle. You need to go find people and come back. And in those years, he actually does exactly that. And good old Ezra, who is told immediately many times what a good person he is with people, he comes back. Wait,
It sucks.
wait, does Ezra come back with the two wives, or is that George?
Yeah, no, Ezra comes back with a sort of, it's inferred that he should go off and find a wife, and he comes back with several. Um, yeah, I just got some notes here. Molly and Jean
Hmm,
are both his. He refers to both of them as his wife, and
mhm,
one of them's got a son too.
right.
Um,
And we find out
uh,
later, we'll find out later in the book that he will like spend 1 week at one of their houses and then another week at another one of their houses.
yeah, yeah, it kind of reminded me. There's a, a fairly small these days section of the Mormon religion. And there was a fictitious TV show called Big Love that sort of showed one of these polygamous marriages.
Hmm.
And it kind of reminded me of that. The sort of she nonchalantly, I think Ish asks one of the women where Ezra is. He said, "Oh, this is the other wife's week, so he'll be at her
Hmm.
house." And there's no shortage of houses, so the logistics at least works. I don't know how the rest of it works, but it seems to go okay in the book.
Yeah, they when that first came in, I thought like, oh, okay, so Ezra's gonna be a bad guy. He's gonna try to take other people's wives, but nah, it seems to work just fine for him. Like, there's nothing about him really being a jerk at any point or any kind of
Well,
overarching like sexual philosophy that's being as soon as that happened, I was a little worried because when I think of sci-fi, I always remember Stranger in a Strange Land, where Heinlein all of a sudden like pumped in all like the free sex thing into that plot.
yeah, yeah. No, I was surprised that that didn't go where I cynically thought it was going to go as well. It just seems to, it says just added calmly after he introduces each of them. This is my wife,
Mhm.
and it seems to work for them.
Yeah, and
Um,
it would also be acceptable in a situation like this where they're pretty adamant, like we need to repopulate.
yeah, it doesn't go into like it doesn't explicitly call out that that's why he's doing it.
Mhm.
I almost think is maybe all the three of them maybe are leaning on the idea that there are no norms anymore.
Mhm.
So if that's what they need to do, there's two children uh, that are already there. It's sort of the book points out that they were from
Mhm.
before the disaster. So family is necessary, and that's a family.
Yeah. So in addition to Ezra, who is mainly good with words, there mm, there's going to be the three men in this community, and they're presented three ways. Where Ish is kind of the leader, bit of an intellectual, like the far planner. Ezra is more the social one. He's good at helping people get along. And George, who is described as just like a very simple man, but like incredibly good with his hands,
Yeah,
which
yeah, he's the
obviously,
carpenter and the plumber and all the rest of it.
yeah, which in a post-apocalypse you definitely can. Which, by the way, before we get too far, there's only two things about the longevity of this book that just bother me that I called bullshit on. Number one is the damn canned food lasting forever.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Little bit of a blip.
Yeah, it's a literary device of a source of food that never runs out. Like canned food does go bad, jug food does go bad.
Mhm.
Um, we invented refrigeration for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it kind of seemed. I kind of expected them to maybe have to fight for food a little more.
Yeah, I thought that was going to
Um,
be a problem. They do the thing with the water at one point where like, oh, we don't have a steady water supply anymore. Now we have to, and that just never really happens with the food.
yeah, and it goes into a lot of detail later in the book where many, many years have passed, like trying to get a car up and running again when the rubber's degraded on the tires. And it goes into like quite a bit of detail about how difficult it is to get a car working.
Mhm.
Um, but that same probity doesn't seem to exist around the food. I guess he just didn't want to be constantly writing about searching for
Mhm.
food, which they do anyway. Like they become accomplished hunters and they sort of get a hunter gatherer thing going.
Mhm.
Um, but he always does fall back that everyone's kind of got a tin opener in their pocket, and there's just grocery stores everywhere that are full of enough food to live your literal
Oh,
entire life.
and again, another thing that the tropes have really spoiled me of with these things. Again, we saw, I don't know, maybe you guys were more well behaved in Australia. When we had the pandemic happen here, people were immediately clearing out the supermarkets. And
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was
we
for,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. We in Australia we sort of got locked down pretty hard.
Hmm.
You'd be in trouble with the police if you're out and about and didn't have one of a handful of good reasons. But absolutely, people immediately just gutted the local supermarkets of toilet paper and pasta were like the two things that everybody just bought. I've it's now been a year, and I've sort of had one of those Facebook memory things where it's like, here's a photo you took exactly a year ago today, and it's of the supermarket sort of 3 blocks away from my apartment building, and it's just cleaned out, fresh
Wow.
vegetables, meat, toilet paper, and stuff. So I kind of I kind of took from the book that this mystery illness that happens in the book compared to coronavirus seems to have been very quick.
Mm.
And maybe this wasn't time for them to do that. Whereas when the real world COVID sort of started up, people were nervous. It wasn't until the government locked people down, said you couldn't go out, that people, for some reason, bought toilet paper. I don't get
Mm.
why that was the thing. I still don't to this day. But yeah, I just guess in the book it was just too quick.
Yeah, it's I can tell you, I was somebody who was going into all that of like, this is dumb, this is crazy, everybody's, overreacting. But when I was in the supermarket itself and I saw that empty aisle, I immediately got that chill down my spine. Like, I need to go get as much toilet paper as I can. I didn't, but I felt the panic.
Well, I got the panic where and I kind of got the panic where I wasn't worried about the lockdowns of the virus. I was worried about everybody else buying all the stuff for dumb
Mhm.
reasons, and then
Yeah,
I couldn't buy like the amount I needed.
all right. So the only other major character I have here who pops up, 'cause there'll be people who come in and out, is Joey. Joey is one of the youngest of the kids of Ish and M, and he seems to be the only one that really has that intellectual spark that
Yeah,
Ish has. And Ish is going to kind of like put all his hopes on him because the other kids, like, they don't even want to learn. Ish is very much, he seems to be the one person in the community of like, we need to get civilization back up and going again, and we need to remember everything that happened before, where it seems like the next generation is already like, we're going to do things our way, but they try to humor him because they respect him and he's the leader.
yeah, he's got a lot of ideas about what he wants the future to look like, and in a lot of ways, it's the past.
Mm-hmm.
He talks a lot about these historical institutions and people not understanding them, and with only a few exceptions, he doesn't really get any truck with getting them to figure out how things work and how the world was. I think one of the exceptions is bows and arrows. Like, he sort of gets them interested in archery, and pretty soon everybody's carving their own bows and arrows. And later in the book, it's a real thing. But he idolizes this local university library and sees it almost as this sort of arc of human knowledge.
He treats
And
it as a temple.
yeah, there's the point where he says in the book how mad he got when some of the kids busted in and just mucked around.
Mm.
Um, yeah, and it was a little bit, to me, it was almost a bit creepy. Like, I get that those things are important, and in a lot of places in the book, some of the people he meets have kind of mentally checked out. Like, they've become
Mm.
unwell, they don't care anymore. There's a couple he meets in Manhattan, and they're basically just hanging out getting drunk. I think he sees this stuff as an antithesis to that, but it's really clear in the book that he thinks so much more of it than everybody else. Gets really frustrated at everybody else, the exception of Joey, for not being into it as he is.
Yeah. And the only other character we mentioned before would be Evie. Evie is a simple girl that Ezra found living in squalor and took in. She grows into an attractive young woman, but the tribe has a rule that no one can marry her. One, because she's simple and just that's not good. And two, her simple mindedness may be genetic and children would be a burden on the community. So,
Yeah, yeah, it's another example of Ish being kind of a dick sometimes.
see, the only thing I would almost wonder if she is not as simple as he believes, if not for the fact that it seems like the entire community kind of agrees.
Yeah, I think they're happy to leave well enough alone. I think there's sort of two reasons in a situation like this why you might do what they did, and sort of no one can marry Evie. And one of them is she actually capable of understanding what's going on? Is she capable of consent? So like, is she mature and there enough to do this? But Ish makes a big deal about how any kids she have might carry the genetic condition. Like, well, that seems like less of a good idea.
Yeah, you're getting kind of into eugenics there, and like intentionally, like, we don't want this in the gene pool.
Yeah. And then looking back at the amount of kids that everybody, like, there's a lot of kids born. There's, I think one of the years they name is the year of lots of babies or something.
Yeah, they're popping them out.
Yeah, and I guess initially I thought, well, there's no great deal else to do, so maybe that's just what happens, right? I guess there was no contraception in any of those stores that they're rating for tin goods. But you get that eugenics vibe when they draw a lot. Whether it's some sort of wanderer shows up with them and shows an interest in Evie, and they react pretty nasty.
We'll get to that right now, but first, so Ish notices that the youngsters are becoming more superstitious, and they have come to regard his hammer as magical. That hammer he grabbed like just as he got bit, that he still carries with him, and it becomes this ceremonial. They not grind. What's the word? Whatever, he uses it to inscribe.
Yeah, carve or. He does it to chisel out the years.
Thank you.
On the rock.
The tip of my tongue. Thank you. But yeah, he uses it to chisel out the year on the rock every year. But it almost becomes a totem and a symbol of his power as community leader, almost literally like Thor's hammer. It has no innate power, but it is the symbol of Ish's leadership, a symbol of the old times. And also, we have the little detail here that the young refer to the old times, their ancient godlike ancestors, as Americans.
Yeah, because that doesn't mean anything anymore in this circumstance. And it's a really interesting what if exercise around, if you do remove everything that has meaning, what happens? And he talks about this superstition where they seem to be building a tradition of their own, and he doesn't like it because he's the intellectual, as you say, and he's very rational minded and thinks that tries actively to discourage it, but everyone's pretty wary of this hammer. Elsewhere in the book, the sort of colony of survivors plays with the idea of religious service, and they sort of get a pseudo church service up and running for a bit, but no one's into it that much. And there's, I think, differences in any faith that they've held before anyway, so it's difficult to find common ground, including, I think he sets himself out as atheist, and one of the other adults thinks that's a variation of Christianity she hasn't heard of. So this idea of what happens if you take away faith, tradition, things that people believe, rightly or wrongly, what happens? And I guess it experiments with the idea that they come up with their own traditions. And one of them is that the hammer is holy in some way. It's a symbol of his authority. And there's later in the book, towards the end, he notices that there's sort of certain turns of phrase that people are using to mean something very specific that comes from the same place. It's sort of a superstitious tradition.
Right. Yeah, I do. Again, it surprises me that there wasn't more. You would think a book that came out in 1949 that very blatantly had, like, they tried to get church going, but there was no real need for it anymore. You would think that would have been a bigger deal at the time, more controversial, if anything.
Yeah. I guess America and Anglosphere countries more generally, I think in a situation like that, particularly at that time, there would have been some discomfort at the idea of not practicing faith in some way. But I actually could completely believe that it was a cultural thing, maybe more than necessarily a genuinely held belief. And I could understand that they might pay lip service to it for a bit, because there are some things that those sort of traditions give you in terms of comfort and security and things like that. I don't know if they do very well post-apocalyptically, and I reckon they probably fall by the wayside pretty quick.
Yeah, humans are very, with or without religion, we have a thing for ritual. We have a thing for ceremony. Like that, religion didn't create that impulse. The impulse created religion. It's going to find somewhere else to go.
Yeah, and in the absence of that, they don't keep on with the alleged religious services, but they do start to build up a belief tradition,
Mm-hmm.
starting with the hammer. And it's funny to see where it comes from. Later in the book, they're forging arrowheads out of old coins. They're not aware what the coins actually are, what they represent, but they know there's heaps of them. And they've got a superstition around copper versus silver coins being better for different sorts of animals. So they're building up that belief system in the absence of one. It was really interesting.
So in part 2, they decide to send out some of the older boys on a cross-country trip to see what's happening with the world. So they send out 2 of the young boys, and we don't get to see what they do. We're just at home, and they're very nervous, and they're wondering when they're going to get back. And one day they return with a bunch of tales, but most importantly, they come back with Charlie. I'm going to state it right now. Fuck Charlie. I am not a fan of Charlie.
Yeah, 100%. I feel kind of the same, and I love the way the author's able to have there be something off about him right away.
And I do love that we've seen it enough with Ish that Ish even questions himself a little bit, where he's like, I might be projecting onto this guy. He has a very immediate, like, I don't like this guy, but then again, he even wonders, like, well, is part of that just because I'm the leader and this is a challenge or a threat? Maybe he's having this inner dialogue like right away. He sees almost everything Charlie does as a challenge until Charlie does actually challenge him.
Yeah, and had the author not done that with Ish sort of questioning himself, I would have been questioning Ish myself as I read, right? So he is judgy. He's got his flaws. So I'm like, is this guy trouble, or are you just being judgy? And he's questioning himself about it. So like, yeah, maybe, but you start to get that feeling about this guy pretty quick. And Charlie puts you offside real quick.
Oh yeah, and so thankfully for Ish, he has somebody else who's believing the same thing, which is Ezra. Ezra pretty much tells him like, oh yeah, Charlie had come to my house that night, and he had some drinks, and it seemed like he had some loose tongue. And Charlie speaks very crassly and seems to have done some terrible things to survive. He even flat out mentions that like he's pretty much had every sexually transmitted disease, which he calls Cupid's diseases, which I'd never heard of before. That's a very
I put that down to a 40s euphemism.
Yeah, that's a cute name for gonorrhea.
Yeah, for sure. Very, very emblematic of the times to sort of talk around stuff like that with cute euphemisms.
Oh, there's in game shows in like the 70s whenever they had to talk about sex, because they would have like the newlywed game, and they'd be like, where's the most interesting place you ever had sex? But it was TV, so you couldn't be that blunt. They'd say, where's the most interesting place you've ever made whoopee?
Yeah. I remember my grandmother and her friends talking about somebody being a confirmed bachelor.
I know what that means.
Yeah, so it's that stuff that was considered taboo or whatever. That's sort of talking around it, and that's the Cupid's diseases. But, it gives you a fuzzy feeling for all of 20 seconds before you realize he means chlamydia.
Yeah, he's a confirmed bachelor. He just hasn't found the right girl yet.
Yeah, forever.
Him and his roommate Michael.
Yeah, exactly right. It's that sort of beating around the bush.
Oh, okay. You know what? Hold on. I actually have a fun grandma story on that. I have a cousin of mine who came out as a lesbian very young to most of the family, but not to my grandmother because we didn't know. And she had brought her girlfriend around all the time to all the family functions and never really explained it. Years later, she comes out to my grandmother, and my grandmother said, that Holly was your girlfriend. I thought she was just some moocher who kept showing up to all these family functions. I thought, why doesn't she have her own family? And just watching my 80-year-old grandmother like, oh, I get it.
Yeah, the other shoe dropped. I think my grandmother in the same situation, I think, thought about it for all the 10, 15 seconds when she realized, went, oh, I suppose things are different these days. And that was it. They might have been different back then as well, but we used terms like making whoopee and confirmed bachelor to kind of cover it up a bit. Like Cupid's diseases, apparently.
Yeah, Cupid's disease. I had I had a wild weekend in Las Vegas, and I came back with some of Cupid's kisses. Let me tell you. So Charlie So Ish is already coming to confront Charlie based on what he said. And one of again, I thought this was going to be a bigger confrontation because we see a lot of the younger people really like Charlie. He finds them sitting around a bonfire and they're all listening to his stories. The only thing is, Charlie is kind of getting a little sweet on Evie.
Mm.
And I honestly feel a little bad for Evie because it seems like she's responding very well to like the first person who doesn't realize, oh, I shouldn't touch her.
Yeah, she's kind of been ignored or tolerated to various extents by everybody else all this time, and someone showing her some attention, some affection, and she likes that. She may not understand what's going on, but she kind of likes it, and that's
Mm-hmm.
when the bristles on the back of my neck started properly standing on end.
Mm-hmm. Which again, I just had that for that brief second, like, oh, is he gonna like, is this gonna it seems something's gonna have to be done with Charlie, but then the question is like, are any of the young people gonna go up against Ish for this? Is
Mm.
I honestly thought they were gonna send Charlie away and then he was gonna come back with more people, which
Yeah,
isn't.
yeah, it's a weird one because it's really the first time in this book since the beginning when Ish feels bad about taking another car, and
Mm,
sort of reconciling himself to the idea that that stuff doesn't have owners anymore and it's kind of open season.
mm-hmm,
This is really the first time in the book that the question of authority has seriously become a problem, right? Everyone
mm-hmm,
up until now has kind of just done what Ish said when it sounded like a good idea, and he's kind of the de facto boss, or they didn't do what he said in situations where it didn't really matter anyway. This is the first confrontation that actually needs to be resolved, and the first situation where you would call the authorities,
mm-hmm.
um, and there are none, so they have to deal with it.
Right. Which always happens with authority. Literally any story where a hero has to emerge, there's always a time where he has to hand out discipline, and it's always something rough. So basically, Ish tells the kids to leave, tells Evie to leave, and gives Charlie the basic like, listen, we don't do that with her. I think you need to be a little more careful. And Charlie basically says, yeah, and what are you gonna do about it?
Yeah, he doubles down. He's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, yeah, you and whose army? And
Yeah.
he's got a point, right? This has to
Yeah.
be resolved old school.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happens. He goes back, and it's pretty much. It seems again, I'm operating on memory a little bit here, but if I believe it's just Ish, the two men, and then M. I think it's said that like the older women don't really get involved in this stuff, but Emma's kind of like the strong one,
Yeah,
and so they discuss what to do about this, and they end up having an anonymous vote after hemming and hawing. And when it's an anonymous vote, all four of them say we need to kill this guy.
yeah, yeah. And I was kind of expecting maybe one hangout at least, but
Right.
they're all pretty unanimous.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and looking at it, their options are limited, right? They talk about, well, what can you do in that situation? You send him away. Well, what's to say he doesn't come back,
Yeah.
right? The guy's obviously a survivor. He talks a lot about the stuff he's done once he's had a few drinks
Mm-hmm.
to stay alive, and it looks like he'll do pretty much anything.
Mm-hmm. And again,
Um,
there is also the danger there in that the younger people seem to take kind of a shine to him after a very limited time.
yeah, he's kind of that bad uncle, right? That one uncle
Huh?
at Christmas that has a few too many and sort of leans across the table and says, "You know what your problem is," but the kids kind of think it's funny. He's kind of cool.
Mm-hmm. But
He's
yeah.
sort of a bad boy, which kids shy to.
Mm-hmm. So they take him out and they hang him, right?
Yeah,
What? Yeah. And we get some immediate consequences from that because it turns out they had good reason to fear Charlie. Something bad was going to happen either way. Charlie was carrying typhoid. It kills many in the community. Ish himself gets sick, which this is actually just a great method of storytelling, just because Ish is kind of like in and out of feverish hallucinations for a while. And then after what happens, we jump ahead, and now he's an old man where he's pretty much living his life still in that mindset.
yeah. It's sort of the second time where he's sort of out of action for days and doesn't really know what's happening, and when he comes to, sort of finds that it's killed a lot of the community, a lot of the younger ones in particular, including his favorite son Joey.
Right. That's the killer. And it's as soon as he was putting all his hopes on Joey, it's like this kid is not making it. And
Yeah, for sure.
And it's
Yeah,
you know that any if anybody in Act Two is like we're all counting on you, son. Like that kid is getting a bullet in the eye any second now.
yeah. That is absolutely a red rag to a George R. R. Martin, right? It's the second
Mhm.
that you pin the hopes of civilization on someone, they're 30 seconds from disaster at any given time. But he doesn't. It's terrible about this is he doesn't even witness it. He just comes to after this extended period, like febrile period, and
Mhm.
finds out that Joey's gone.
Mhm.
Um, so there's no saying goodbye. There's just he succumbed while you were ill.
Mhm. So we have another section of the quick years, and then bring us to the last chunk of this book, part three, The Last American. Ish is the last of the originals. We saw that I think M died a good like 7, 8 years before him, and was very much, it was sad. It was a big thing for the community because even though everybody had their own mothers, much like Ish was the leader, M had a very there wasn't anybody quite filling M's role as
No.
kind of like mother to the community. And like she seemed to, again, a little bit of the times. I think if this was written today, they're probably more stronger female characters, but in this particular community, it's just M.
Yeah, it's explicitly clear that sort of the gender roles of the 40s and 50s are here,
Mhm.
right? There's the women except for M have nothing to do with the hanging. There's very definitely women's work and men's work, but she was sort of the strong woman and is now gone.
Mhm. Ezra is around for a little bit. Ezra and Ish are more or less they're in their twilight years. They hang around. They talk about the old times. They don't really do much until Ezra himself also dies. Uh, there's something in here. I think they say they join with another community, and there's like a
Yeah,
whole. Yeah, it's actually kind of a blip. They don't get into it too much, but it does. I'm glad he included it, even if we don't get a lot of the details. It's something that would happen at some
yeah. We
point.
we, we get we get a bit of an inkling that there are other communities around. So when the boys go away,
Mhm.
they find an East Coast community that appear to have really picked up the religion, right? They're all wearing robes and they're very exclusionary. They chase the boys off. And there's talk about some other communities existing in the South and things like that. So there are pockets of people that have found each other over the years,
Mhm.
including one just sort of across the body of water from them.
Mhm.
So they join up with them.
Mhm. And oh yeah, actually, that's the process they're in because they're starting to move things. Well, I'm jumping a little bit. So now that Ish is the last American left, his ancestor, his progeny revere him as kind of a living god. They've
Yeah.
reverted to the ways of Native Americans, where they're mostly wearing loincloths. Their language is already taking on like strange pronunciation. I always mispronounce pronunciation.
It's a weird little irony, huh?
Yeah.
Mispronunciation.
Mhm. The one annoying little detail, but I kind of love, is that these young ones will ask Ish questions because again, he's like the living god, but he's like a tired old man, so sometimes he doesn't want to answer. So they're simultaneously asking, like, you are our wise god, and he's like, I don't want to talk, and they'll just like pinch him when he's not
Yeah,
giving them information.
yeah, it's the weirdest little microaggression. Like it's the way you'd harass a cat if it won't move off the bed. Like it's the weirdest little detail.
Yeah, I'd be more inclined to tickle a god, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I would like pat his face or poke him or something. The pinch seems to be weird. Yeah, these guys, these growing children, as growing into men who are described as sort of they still wear some of the clothes that they can find around, so jeans or whatever, but on top they're like yeah, they're getting sort of a bit of animism going where they're wearing animals, presumably the toughest one that they personally killed. So you just go with a mountain lion uh, cape and blue jeans, pinching this
And
guy because he won't give them advice.
and at this point, they've also moved to mostly bow and arrow, just because they've gotten to the point now where bullets are limited. Not all of them work because they've just kind of
Yeah,
degraded over time.
yeah, they
Um,
see them as being as one of the kids explicitly, or the children. They're not children; they're grown, but the
right.
progeny. Um, Sort of laughs at his suggestion that they should learn to shoot because, as everybody knows, right, rifles work one time in five.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those weird ones where he doesn't get a pass about the tinned food because the author will concede that car rubber on
Mhm.
tires will degrade
But
and
the other thing
powder
I
inside
left
shells will.
the other thing I left out, gasoline degrades in like if gasoline in 10 years does not work anymore. It splits into its different components. Yet there's
Yeah,
always like we get further on and they're like, oh, we don't really do that anymore, but it lasts way longer than it should have.
yeah. He's finding petrol just sort of lying around pretty much everywhere, and eventually they get to sort of dog sleds
Hmm.
um, as their way of getting around, which makes a certain amount of sense. But yeah, there's his understanding of American geography much surpasses his understanding of petrochemical science.
Hmm. So, the climax of the book, Ish wakes up to his house burning down. Again, this is also mentioned as the ecology, which is just as the years have gone with like nobody to put out these fires, they just rage.
Hmm.
Um, the younger people burst into the house and take him out and some of his things. They make sure to grab the hammer. They travel
Yeah,
with Ish, these three progeny of his of the community. As they are crossing a bridge, he starts fading out. Ish is dying. His three descendants put him down on the other side of the bridge and they look at him expectantly, expecting him to appoint a new leader before dying. When Ish doesn't get this right away, they of course begin pinching him because
is that the way you get a solution?
yeah,
Just pinch the oracle until you get an answer.
please leave a dying man unpinched. He hands the hammer to his great grandson Jack, making him the new leader, and Ish dies. And that's the end of the story. I love it
Yeah,
so much.
it's I still had stuff like I'm really glad of this opportunity to talk about it. So there's so many questions.
Mhm.
Like it makes sense that he dies there. It's a fitting conclusion to the story, but there's so much stuff that the author casually plays with and then puts back. Like he notes that the language is starting to change, that their pronunciation of words is starting to sound foreign.
Mhm.
Um,
I think the word
it
he uses exactly is somebody says "see" over there, but they pronounce it as like "ski" or there, and just
yeah,
like the tiny little smidges of the language evolving.
Yeah, so we get this glimpse of language starting to evolve, and they've obviously selected a hereditary method of transferring leaders, but it's not really talked about.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of want to play with this world more. I want
Oh,
to see what happens to the
he
language.
absolutely leaves you wanting more on this. Again, he could have written another book that takes right up from great grandson Jack, and it would have been amazing.
Yeah,
But left it as it
yeah.
was.
I almost want to see I want to read the other books. I'm left wanting more, but
Mhm.
I assume the author, wherever they are, is cackling at the idea. Just sort of dropped it, and then he died.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Um,
like a bit the way you sort of finished off your creative writing stories in third grade, right? And
mhm.
then everyone died at the end.
The end. All right. So, real quick, you get to rebuild society. You can be as petty and particular as you like. What do you remove from existing society and what do you add to it?
I so what I'm going to remove a lot of the things that Ish is concerned about in the book. I think they're better off without. So some of the power
Mm,
structures and
mm,
things like that. Now, there's obviously some use for authority and force, but in the US as well as Australia, right? There's ongoing conversations about who benefits from that and why.
right.
Um, so faced with the idea of a whole new world, I don't think we need as many bosses and leaders as what we've got. So the idea of starting afresh and being open-minded to the way things can go. So Ish is like, oh, we need to. There's almost this hagiography of we need art and music and reading. He talks a lot when the first time when M has a child, his first idea is to run to the library and read books about gynecology and obstetrics. I think knowledge is great, but some of the power structures around it aren't. Um, and I reckon we could leave them behind if that happened. What I like to take forward is I'm a big foodie. I love to cook. I love to eat. I do a lot of reading about food and traditional diets and things like that. Um, it takes them a long time in the book to sort of start playing around with gardening and start playing around with agriculture, and they start to try and grow stuff that isn't ideal Like they go straight to corn, which doesn't grow particularly well where they are. So given a blank slate society, I'd like to play around with how you produce food. I think agriculture could be done better, rather than just rotating corn and soy.
Yeah,
so those are the things that I'd be pushing for.
Okay. I didn't have anything clever at all about that. When I was thinking like what would I remove from society? I just thought like, shirts. Let's just go shirtless. We don't need this. Put a little sunblock on, you're fine.
Where I live, so Sydney's climate, it's really hot during the summer. It gets to 100 degrees quite easy. And it could be very, very humid. I'm like, thinking about it, if we could just start again with no norms, I don't see why guys can't wear skirts.
Geordie. Yes. So the brief story here. Years ago, you remember the show Lost? Yeah, obviously dealt with Australia quite a bit. The show Lost, we were at my friend's house for a season premiere. They had a new little puppy, but we were having like people over to watch this. And I'm playing with this adorable little puppy, and he urinates all over my pants. We have people coming over. I don't have time to go home. My friend's girlfriend throws me a skirt. I have never been more comfortable in my life than a long black skirt, just comfy, getting breeze.
Yeah. So imagine living somewhere like Sydney. It's 98 degrees and 80% humidity for like 3 days straight. Skirts. I would wear less mountain lions than what they wear in the book, but I would look at that.
Okay, there we go. Our plot, Geordie and Jesse's plot for the future. Pants are gone, skirts are in. So I have some random little things here to wrap up. Jimi Hendrix called Earth Abides his favorite book. I did not know that.
There you
go. Some quotes, obviously the end, straight from the Bible. Men come and go, but earth abides. The trouble you're expecting never happens. It's always something that sneaks up the other way.
Ain't that the truth?
It is a strange thing, he thought, to be an old god. They worship you, and yet they mistreat you. If they do not want to do what they wish, they make you. It is not fair. And then I added at the end, they also pinch you. Yeah.
Come on, do the God thing.
Do the God thing. Be a god. Be a god. Yeah, I love the thing at the end. This is my own personal thoughts about death, because I think about it a lot as I refer to myself as a begrudging atheist. Like, I want there to be something. I just don't really think so. And that bums me out. I've had the thought that like younger members of my family will be my pallbearers one day to carry the coffin. But then even when I think about that, you remember how long life can be. And realistically, if I live to an old age, these babies I'm picturing, like I think like, my nephew, you'll carry to my grave one day. Like if I live to 80, he'll be 50 something. He will be beyond that. So just the notion of thinking like the people who will be my pallbearers aren't even on the earth yet. Like,
yeah,
that just makes me stop and thinking. And I remember a funeral I went to a few years ago. I never this was like my great uncle, and somebody had brought like their 6-month-old baby to this funeral, which, God bless shitty, unreliable babysitters everywhere. Cause I found that to be like the most beautiful thing. I have said since, like, every funeral should have a baby there, because it is like a perfect humanity. Like, here we come.
Perspective, hey.
Yep, there we go, and here we come, and it's just,
yeah, it's just the rolling forward of humanity.
Yeah, just those tiny little things. Well, Geordie, that's all I got, man. This was good. I knew it, but I needed to actually feel. I wanted to talk about this book with somebody so much.
Same. So thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, man. Well, I'm glad if I talked to somebody. I'm glad it was you. This was really good. I love podcasting for this. There is almost no circumstance in the world that you and I would have probably met, even if I wandered my way over. Maybe I'll rise up in this company and I'll end up taking over the Sydney offices, and maybe then we would have run into each other. But
if that ever happens, I'll buy you a beer.
Hell yes, because I am cheap and I don't tip. Guys,
we don't tip in this. We don't tip in this country, so it'll be a cheap beer.
oh god, okay, never mind. I take it back. Skirts are in, tipping is out. We need to fix that here. It's too much. All right. Geordie, I'm gonna end this the way every episode. I am going to stop recording, but you and I can keep chatting for a second. Say goodbye to all the nice people out there in podcast land.
Bye bye, nice people in podcast land.